Hello again, welcome back. It's so good to see you as much as you can see anybody on the internet. We're going to continue working on our React and Redux asynchronous application. In the previous two videos, we set up React, Redux, and Redux Thunk. And then we also set up a component that lets us input our zip code, and we're going to use this to load the weather data. And this time we're going to be loading the weather data, but we're going to be doing it with Redux. So the data will be loaded into the global Redux store and shared throughout our application that way, okay? This will be different than what we did in the previous weather application that we created, right? So we're kind of upgrading this to using a global store. So far we've got our component set up here that has a form that lets us enter the zip code, and now we need to do something when you submit that form, right? So remember, all actions or all changes to the global state happen through an action, right? So we need to define an action for this, right? So I'm going to go to my actions folder and I'm going to create a new action. I'm going to say export const load weather, okay? And I'll just paste this here. So this is our action, right? And every action has a corresponding action creator, like a function, right? That works with that action. So this is just kind of the name or identifier for the action, right? But the actual action is generated as an object, and we have a function to do that. So let's set this up. Let's do export const load weather equals, and I always like to name this one the same name as the action up here, but I do it in camel case, okay? So here's our action, and the action needs, if it's going to take any information in, we can put that information here as a parameter. So, in order to load the weather, I need to know where where I need to load the weather from. So this function is going to receive a zip code, okay? So we'll take that in. Now, normally you would do this with our regular Redux project. You would say, let's return an object with a type and a payload, okay? Right, and you might put the zip code here or some other information. But in our case, we're going to do this like a little bit differently, okay? So instead of, because we're going to be using Redux Thunk. So remember, this is going to be an async action, okay? So we want to do this as an async using Thunk. Okay, so how does that work, right? So how do we, really what we need to do is we need to go out on the internet, pull in the weather data here, and then when we're done, we need to put the weather data here as the payload, okay? Which is really what I want to do. I want to load the weather data, like load weather data. I want to do that first and then wait and then do this stuff, okay? So the way I'm going to handle that here is like this. I'm going to delete what we did there, and instead of returning an object, I'm going to return a function, okay? And this is the thunk, okay? Thunky, right? So this is the thunk here, okay? Right? So instead of returning an object, we're going to return a function. And what's going to happen is, since we installed Redux Thunk as middleware, Redux, if it receives an action that's a function rather than an object, it will pass the dispatcher into that function as a parameter. So Redux is going to give us the dispatcher, right? And it's going to expect us to do some work and then call the dispatcher when we're done, okay? So I'm going to put dispatch here. I'm going to return a function. I'm going to configure that function to take dispatch as a parameter. You can actually name this anything you like, right? And then I'm also going to make this an async function, okay? Because that'll just make it easier for me to handle it, right? So because we're gonna have some fetch in here, and we're going to need to wait for the call to fetch to resolve, right, for the promises to resolve. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna make this an async function, and then I can use a wait in here. And then when we're done at the bottom here, we can call the dispatcher with the object that we want, right? So like if I leave this stuff empty right there, when we call the dispatcher, what we want to do is we want to send it an object with a type, right? Like load weather, and maybe a payload, right? Which will be our weather data. Okay, so this is what we would normally be returning from this function, but in our case, we've returned a function that will return this or call dispatcher with it, okay? Right, so we're gonna send a function out. The dispatcher is gonna pass itself into the function. We're gonna do some work here, it does work. And then when we're done doing the work, we're going to call the dispatcher with a regular action object like we normally would. Okay? So anyway, that's our setup there. We're going to need to do a little bit of work because we don't have the weather data here, right? So this is not quite complete, and we need to actually load the weather data here. So to load the weather data, I need to get my my API key here, which I think I have in this other file. So I'm just going to go steal that from this other file. If you have an Open Weather Map API key, you can use your API key. If you don't have one, you can stop the video now and then go to Open Weather Map and get the API key. If you're not sure how to do that, see the previous video that I did, and you can follow the instructions there, okay? So I'm going to go get my action here, and you can see this is kind of the solution, right? And I'm going to get this stuff. I'm just going to copy, because we also need this Open Weather Map URL. So I'm just going to copy these two lines, and then I'm going to paste them into here. Okay, so let me try and arrange this so we can see the whole thing, right? And we're going to use this. I'm going to use my API key here, and you'll replace that with your API key. And then I'm going to create a path variable, right? So my path is HTTPS API openweathermap.org data 2.5 weather ? Zip code, and then I'm going to take the zip code that you passed in and put it here, and then ampersand next variable is API ID, and this will be the API ID. And then last, I added ampersand units, and then I set the units to imperial. Since I'm in the United States, I'm just going to use Fahrenheit instead of Celsius, but you could switch this to metric if you like. Okay, so now that we're set up here, we can actually run our call to fetch. So I'm going to say fetch, and then I'm going to say response equals await fetch, and then we're going to call fetch with this path. Okay, so remember, when you call fetch, it's a two-step process. So the first step, you pass a path into fetch, and fetch returns a promise that resolves to a response object. So this is my response. And that kind of represents a connection to the server. And once you have a response, you can start streaming things from the server, okay? I used a wait here so that we would resolve the promise. So we're gonna, since this is an async function, we can stop on this line until that promise is resolved, and then I get the result here, okay? So next, we're gonna resolve to some JSON data, okay? And I'm gonna await response.json. And by doing response.json, I'm going to tell the response object that I'd like to stream the data as JSON, okay? As a JSON object. And then that returns a promise also. So I'm going to await here for that promise to resolve. And when it resolves, it should resolve to a JSON object. Now, I'm not handling errors yet, but maybe we'll handle that later just to keep things simple here, right? Because we're kind of doing something new with this thunk. But essentially, this is very similar to the code that we wrote before, except we moved it out of the React component and into our action, right? So we put it in our Redux action, okay? So now that we got the data here, remember the JSON data, it's going to provide a .cod property, and that if it's 200, we know that everything's good, and if it's not 200, there was the response from the server contains an error. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say, hey, if, and then I'm going to check the JSON object. So I'm going to actually, let's actually deconstruct it first. I think that'll be better. Let's do const, and let's get the COD and the message. So if there's a COD error and it's not 200, then message will have a value in it. If COD is 200, then message will be undefined, right? So let's do this. Let's say JSON. So that should deconstruct this into COD, and then I'm going to check COD, and I'm going to say, hey, if you're not 200, right? So anything but 200 is an error. Now this character might look a little weird, but it's basically just the exclamation point and the two equal signs, right? But my font that I'm using kind of draws a special character like this. I think it's fun, so I've been using that, right? So anyway, so if this is like where we have an error, right, on a server error, right, or actually let's call this on a response error, okay? And in that case, actually, maybe we still want to do this, and actually we could make a new action that was maybe like weather error or something like that, but I'm actually just going to say load weather like this, right? And I'm going to call load weather, and the payload right here is going to be an object, but what I want to do is give it some properties like COD and message. Okay, so we'll just have the COD and message if there's an error. Okay, if there's not an error, then I can start getting the other data like the temperature and other things, right? So to understand where these properties come from, we got to take a quick look at the Open Weather Map site and look at their documentation, right? You could also log it to the console and read the response object there. So I'm going to go to the API here. Well, maybe we'll do both, right? So I'm going to go to their API. I'm going to go to the current weather data API right there, go to the docs, and then they're going to give us a sample object here. If we scroll down a little ways. Oh yeah, here it is, JSON, right? So it says example of API response. So you can see here's the object at the top, and then it gives us a coord property, a weather property with ID main description icon, a base property, and a main property with temperature. Okay, so just to keep things simple for right now, I want to get to main temp. So in here, I'm going to say const, and actually maybe let's take a quick look at that again. What else do we got there? Feels like, temp min, temp max, pressure, and humidity. So we could get any of these properties here. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to deconstruct those. And I think, let me just sorry, my memory is bad. Yeah, it's just temp, T-E-M-P, right? So I'm going to get temp, and I'm going to deconstruct it from JSON.main, okay? And then if I wanted to get feels like and temp, min, and max, like I could add those properties here, okay? So I've got these, and now what I want to do is I want to dispatch an action to the, to Redux and have it process that action. So I did my asynchronous code here, and now I'm actually going to dispatch the action. So the action is going to be load weather, and then the payload right here can be whatever you want. I'm going to put temp, and I'll put the feels like in here too, okay? And actually we can put the COD property in there also, because we've decoded that one. You could put the message in here too, but it would be undefined because it'll be undefined when there is no error, okay? Right, so so that looks pretty good. So what do we need to do next? So we've got our action set up, right? The next step is to create a reducer. So let's set up our reducer here and get that working, right? So I'm going to go to my reducers folder, and I'm going to create a new file called weather reducer.js. Okay, so here's weather reducer.js, and in here I'm going to import from my actions folder, and I want to get the action identifier for load weather, right? So I'll do, actually I got to do // because we got to go up a folder, oops, and I want to go to the actions folder, and I want to get the load weather action, the uppercase one. Okay, so I want the name of the action because I'm going to match this here. Okay, and then I'm going to make a new function here. So let's do const weather reducer equals, and we'll just use a arrow function. And then just so we remember, I'm going to export default weather reducer at the bottom. Okay, and as always, a reducer function takes in two properties. Or two parameters. It takes in state and an action. Okay, so I got state and I got my action. So state will be the default, will be the previous state, and then we're going to return state here. Action will be the action object that your action creator function returns. So over here, the action object might be this object here, or it might be this object here. Okay, so if we failed to load the weather, it's going to be this object with COD and message, and if we loaded the weather successfully, it'll be this one, and the payload will have the temperature and the feels like and the COD on it. Okay. One other thing, reducers are responsible for the default application state. So we got to put something here to give state a default value. So I'm going to just say equals null. Okay. So if we don't have any weather data, then the state for the weather data will be null. Okay, let's add a switch case now. So if something happens when we're loading the weather data, we might say action.type, and then we're going to match that type against one of the or against one of our actions that we've imported. Since I only have the one action, it's going to be just this one, right? So I'll say case load weather, and in that case, what are we going to do? We're going to do something here, right? Okay. And if we don't match this one, we should always return state. So I'm going to put that in here first because that one's always going to be the same, right? So in this case, if the action type doesn't match this one, we'll just return state unchanged and then continue. Okay. Oops. Sorry. Sometimes those pop-up menus are a little too aggressive. Okay, so we're almost done here. We've got our load weather here. What are we going to do when we load the weather? Right? Remember our action right here, the payload object really has all the data that we want, right? So it's really like this kind of object right here is what we want to store. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say return action.payload. Okay, and you could make this more complicated if you want. You could pull pieces off of the payload or process them in some way, but in our case, I'm just going to return the payload object. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We need to do one more thing. Okay, we actually have a few more steps, but for getting this set up, we're pretty good. So the other thing we need to do is in the reducer right here in the index file, we need to import our weather reducer and then add it to combine reducers. So this is the thing that was missing here earlier, right? So I'm going to go get weather reducer from / weather reducer, and then right here I'm going to say weather : is handled by the weather reducer. Okay, so weather is going to be the key on our state object that stores the data that's returned from the weather reducer. So let me actually split that and let's talk about these things, right? So so here's our weather reducer. Actually, maybe if I do this, if I make another thing here, and I'll in this one I'm going to put our action so we can see all three things side by side, right? It's a little hard to read there maybe, but let's take a look. So in the root reducer, so reducer's index, we're going to do combine reducer here. We're going to call combine reducer, and we're going to return an object, and this object determines the shape of state. Okay, so the shape of state is going to be an object with a key called weather. Okay, and then the value here is the value that's returned from the weather reducer. So in my case, the weather reducer might return null. So our weather data might look like this, right? And it will at the beginning of our app. When you call your action, and the action, goes through all the trouble to load your data with fetch, and then generate an object, it might generate an object that looks like this right here, and that's the payload, remember? So it would be COD and message, or the payload down here, if it loads the temperature data, it would look like this. It would be temp, feels like, and COD, right? So remember, that's the payload, and if I go over here to my reducer, you can see if load weather ran successfully and we took the payload that you returned and we return it here, that's the value that comes out here and gets assigned to weather. So that means, like, let's say we load the weather data from Beverly Hills, and the weather is 72 degrees, or the temperature is 72 degrees, then here we would be returning an object from the payload that has a temp of 72 degrees, and the weather reducer would assign it to the weather key. And so that means here we would have an object that would be temp, and it would have 72 degrees there, right? And it would also have a COD of 200 and a feels like of whatever we put in there, okay? Whatever that was, right? So I'll just put ... there, okay? So that's kind of like how this works. We got the action, it's going to return some data, it's going to go to the reducer is going to handle that, and if it does something with it, it's going to return new state, and the new state that you return gets assigned to the key here, okay? And then that's what your state looks like, okay? Now there's one more step, like when you pull that out with use selector, this is what you're going to get, right? You're going to get this object here like this, okay? So, or it's going to look like this or similar anyway, right? Okay, so let's stop the video here, mull that over. If you want, as a challenge, go ahead and try and set up a component, or actually I guess we have that component to enter the zip already. Use that component to try and call your load weather action with the zip code, and then try and set up a component to display the weather data using use selector. And I'll go over those in the next video, okay? And that'll be our next step, but try it on your own and see how much you can remember. So again, thanks for watching, and as always, have a great day.